South Africa. May 5, 2022. Think back, my friends, to mid-November 2021. Borders were reopening, testing requirements were being loosened, and masking mandates were being dropped around the world. This is the moment we jumped on a fantastic deal advertised for an 11-day trip to South Africa offered by Exotica for April 2022. And then, November 24th, news out of South Africa comes a new COVID variant, Omicron. Borders slammed shut in an instant, especially the South African border. But we were hopeful since we had so much time. We didn't have to pay the balance of the trip until 60 days out, and we could cancel up until then. Details would be finalised by Exotica 30 days out, including which flights we would be on and where we would be staying. We were pleasantly surprised when details came to us sooner than that. On the morning of 30 days out, Andrew logged into our account to check that everything was in place, only to see across the top of the booking in red letters, "Cancelled." Without so much as an email, Exotica just left us high and dry. The best explanation we managed to get from them was that there was a problem with one of their operators, but for more money we could book another trip the following week. What a generous offer! The weekend help desk weren't even able to initiate a refund. They can only take your money, not give it back. Thankfully, after a few weeks we did get our refunds, which is the only good thing I can say about Exotica at this point. I would never book with them again or refer anybody else to them. One final strange thing happened during our trip, which makes me suspicious of what actually went down. We rebooked essentially the same trip independently, with a flight from Johannesburg to Cape Town on April 25th. The flight was delayed, and when we landed, ours was the only flight arrival at that time. As we were being escorted by our driver, what do I see but some guy standing there in the arrivals terminal holding up a sign reading Exotica Group. In any case, the spectre of Omicron subsided. Testing requirements were mostly scaled back, and on April 20th, we departed for our South African adventure. We left Windsor on a 10:30 a.m. flight on April 20th and arrived in Johannesburg at 6 p.m. local time on April 21st, for a total travel time of approximately 28 hours. We picked up our rental car and programmed the GPS to take us to our airport hotel, where we were going to spend the night before setting out to Kruger. Unfortunately, we programmed the GPS to the hotel's shuttle pickup point at the airport and drove around in a 3-kilometre loop twice, on the wrong side of the road, in the dark before figuring out what the problem was. Sleep deprivation is no joke. We were up at about 4:30 a.m. to pack up and hit the road by sunrise. The desk clerk even sweet-talked the restaurant into firing up the toaster and coffee machine early so we could get something to eat before setting out. Unbeknownst to us, due to a quirk of geography, the highway from Johannesburg to Kruger is prone to very dense fog. This is because it sits in a region known as the Highveld, atop the Great Escarpment at an altitude of 1,500 metres or so, and the air cools and condenses overnight. The speed limit on this fog-prone highway is 120 kilometres per hour, but at least there are signs warning of the fog. We had decided to break up the lengthy drive to Kruger National Park with a side trip down the Panorama route to visit the Graaskop Gorge Lift Company here. You can take a 200-foot elevator ride down into the gorge and walk a trail lined with Afro-montane forest. You can also walk across the gorge on a suspension bridge. For thrill seekers, there is also a zip line and a big swing bungee jump experience. We spent a little over an hour here and grabbed some lunch before hitting the road for our final leg to the park. We had planned our day fairly tightly as we had to be at our lodging by 6 p.m. when they closed the gates. Late arrivals face fines. We had to get through the town of Hazyview and enter the park through the Fabini Gate. About 20 minutes after we left the gorge, we were stopped dead by a road closure for cliff remediation and rock slide cleanup work. We watched the crew high up the side of the cliff and started mentally preparing secondary routes to the park. Thankfully, after only 15 minutes, a front-end loader cleared the fallen rock enough for a single lane of traffic to pass through. It was with great relief that we crossed through the Fabini Gate around 3 p.m. We had a 45-minute drive east to the Kruger rest camp, and then an hour south to Berg-en-dal, where we would be staying. Just barely through the entry gates, we saw our first impalers, and they had some oxpeckers hitchhiking on the group, our first classic African bird species. Just after that, we spotted our first young male elephant sauntering down the road. We were a bit nervous about this sighting, having watched too many videos of elephants charging cars on the roads. There was no tutorial on how to behave during close encounters. We followed at a respectful distance as he continued his walk before eventually moving off to the side to munch some shrubbery. And with a quick rev of the gas pedal, we zipped past, checking in the rear view that he wasn't giving chase. We thought we were managing our time really well and had planned to browse around Kruger for about an hour before heading on to our camp. That was before all the animals. We saw impaler, elephants, giraffes, kudu, wildebeest, waterbuck, hippos, and zebras, all before we managed to get to Kruger. This barely left us with enough time for a quick gas fill-up at the camp before we absolutely had no choice but to immediately hit the road south to Berg-en-dal. A little panicky about the 6 p.m. curfew at this point, we were travelling about 62 kilometres per hour when traffic enforcement flagged us over and ticketed us for exceeding the 50 kilometres per hour speed limit on tar roadways in the park. They were not at all sympathetic to our timing issue. He told us there's usually a 15-minute grace period and to just drive normally from then on. From Kruger to Berg-en-dal, we managed to spot hyenas, dwarf mongooses, warthogs, and 3 adolescent male lions who came out of the bush and laid in the road close enough that you could have reached out and touched them if you're that kind of stupid. We arrived to our rest camp a few minutes before 6 p.m. just as daylight was dying. A quick check-in, and we hopped over to the shop to pick up some food for the next morning, as we would be up and out of camp before anything opened the next day for our bushwalk. The Berg-en-dal rest camp is considered the new style camp, having been built in 1984. The newness apparently refers to the architectural style of the bungalows rather than actual age. The camp has a restaurant, 2 to 3 person bungalows, family chalets, and a 72-site campground with trailer hookup. It is located along a river with a dam behind the restaurant, and there is a walking trail that circles a good portion of the perimeter with interpretive signage. There is also the Rhino Hall Educational Centre and a small amphitheatre that shows nature films in the evenings. Unfortunately, our time there was so short and our days out in the park so long, we didn't get to experience the camp itself very much. Our bungalow was along the perimeter, chosen for the potential for wildlife patrolling the fence. But number 39 is not an ideal site for fence watching, as it's on a bit of a rise with dense forest behind it. The accommodations were clean and well maintained during our stay, with a powerful air conditioning unit and nice warm water in the shower. The kitchen had the essential tools for cooking, but we were lacking in some cooking basics like butter, salt and pepper, which hadn't occurred to us until we tried to cook eggs and toast the following morning. My only gripe about the bungalow was the dim lighting. It was like living in perpetual dusk, but since we were barely there, it didn't matter too much. A bushwalk, a sunset drive, and everything between. May 6, 2022. For our first full day in Kruger, we had pre-booked a morning bushwalk and a sunset drive. These can be easily booked on the Excellent Sandparks website or booked on site once you arrive at your camp. We were up at 4:30 a.m. to get ready for our 5:45 a.m. meeting time and 6 a.m. departure. The bushwalks are limited to 8 guests accompanied by 2 armed rangers. We were accompanied by Rasta and Dolphy like Dolphin, not like Dorothy as she says. Less than 5 minutes down the road from camp, we came upon a lion cub and its mother. They tell you over and over again that the animals in park are used to cars as part of the landscape. But if you stand up in the safari jeep or you stick some part of your body outside the vehicle, it will spook them, and there's no telling how any given animal may react. As we all sat in hushed whispers in the jeep, we got a truly special experience seeing this cub fearlessly exploring the area as its mother watched nearby. They estimated that this cub would be around 3 or 4 months old. We pulled off the main road into a clearing where they also set up the Bush Braais barbecue that can be booked through the camps. We got out of the jeep and they explained to us the code of conduct for the walk. We would walk single file behind the guides, stick to the same path and no talking. They would periodically stop and we could gather up, and they would share information with us about what we were seeing and ask any questions that came up. In case of a hostile animal, they would direct us to shelter behind a nearby landscape feature and attempt to defuse the encounter. Firing their weapons is an absolute last resort, if they deem the situation to be life-threatening. They were so alert and attuned to our surroundings they picked up on things that the rest of us just completely overlooked. They were very impressive and highly knowledgeable. Early on in the walk, Rustas spotted a group of white rhinoceros grazing about 100 yards away. With Dolphy standing on alert, he crept closer with the group in tow while making a deep whistling sound. Apparently, this is a noise that rhinos make, and it confuses them enough to keep them standing still while assessing where it's coming from. We were able to approach within 40 feet as they were on the other side of some shrubs to where we were watching. It was truly amazing to be standing out there in their presence. Most of the white rhinos in the park periodically undergo horn removal by the rangers to protect them from poaching. As the horn is made of keratin, like our fingernails, it continues to grow back. We variously heard hyenas, impala in rut and spotted some distant elephants in the hillsides. Much of the walk was filled with information about animal behaviours and plant life in the park. The trail we were walking was not man-made, but rather a well-travelled game trail. I can't even describe to you how much poop was everywhere all the time. One of our informational stops was alongside a white rhino midden. This is a communal dung heap that's used by rhino groups to communicate via olfaction. The dominant male can use the midden to determine if nearby females are ready for breeding, and subordinate males will be alerted to presence of a dominant male. The dominant male of the group will pin the centre of the midden and then kick his poop quite some distance behind him, broadcasting his presence. Only white rhinos use middens. Black rhinos do not participate in this behaviour. We also learned that elephants like to eat tree bark rather than just leaves. This often results in the death of the trees. They have particular favourites, like the round-leaved teak, which rarely attain tree height in the park due to overgrazing by elephants. Another fun factoid we picked up is that while hyenas can digest bones swallowed whole, they cough up fur balls like domestic house cats. Hyena poop is very rich in calcium thanks to the bones they ingest. As it dries out, it becomes a valuable source of calcium in the diets of other animals, as it is otherwise hard to come by in nature. We stopped on a rocky outcropping for some lunch, and while the group chatted, Andrew and I were attempting to bird watch. We did manage to spot a distant bearded woodpecker, one of Africa's largest woodpecker species. After lunch, we stopped to hear a lion roaring. Now, lion roars can be heard up to 8 km away, so this wasn't necessarily an indication that it was nearby, but Ruster seemed to think that it could be hanging out back around the clearing where the jeep was. So under instructions to stay close and move quickly, we hoofed it back at a pretty quick pace. Unfortunately, there was no lion at the end of our march, where the jeep was parked. Because we had chosen the morning bushwalk, when we returned back to camp, it was only 10 am, leaving us the rest of the day to self-drive before our sunset drive. Self-driving in Kruger is very easy and accessible. Even most of the gravel roads are easily passable in a regular sedan. There are obvious advantages, primary among them, that you're not reliant or tied to anybody else's schedule or route. One of the silver linings that came out of the Exotica fiasco was that we were better able to tailor our trip to our own liking, which now meant we were driving ourselves. We had plenty of great sightings throughout the course of the afternoon. We came across 4 southern ground hornbills, which were a major target species for me. They live in family groups, and only the dominant breeding pair reproduce. Because the offspring rely on the adults for up to 3 years, it can be a long time between successful breeding cycles. There are also some cultural superstitions associating them with death and misfortune, and because of this, they can be persecuted in unprotected areas. Other highlights of the day included an elephant drinking from a puddle at the side of the road. Lunch at the Affasil trading post, a huge male giraffe sighting that we had all to ourselves as he scratched his neck on a tree. Clip springers, and an adorable warthog family. We returned to camp for our 4:15 p.m. meeting time, and our sunset drive headed out at 30 p.m. We were lucky enough to have Dolphy as our driver and guide again. She has such sharp eyes. We found us a hare, a flap-necked chameleon, and a pair of double-banded sandgrouse, which nobody but us really cared about. We also had several white rhino sightings, spotted a pride of lions dozing in a clearing at sundown, and a hippo out of water after dark. We also managed to catch the same lion cub and its mother out on the road again near camp. A sunset drive is a great way to extend your wildlife viewing in the park, as they are allowed outside of the camp gates past the 6 p.m. curfew. There are also night drives which depart around 8 p.m. to maximize your chances of seeing the truly nocturnal creatures at their most active. We had done some grocery shopping at the camp shop in preparation for a bray on our back patio, but by the time we got back to camp we were so beat we just begged the restaurant for some takeaway before they closed for the night and ate it back in our bungalow. I've never had a more satisfying chicken salad sandwich. Birding Kruger, April 24, 2022. Back with our original booking for this trip. This day was a free day with an optional game drive. We decided that we would hire a birding guide for the day. This way, we could still see big game sightings incidentally, but be focused on birds. Every time we were out driving, when we would pull over, someone would stop and ask what we were looking at. When we told them it was birds, they would just say, "Oh," and carry on. Honestly, I get it. Thinking back to my pre-birding days, I probably would have had the same reaction. But given that you can drive many kilometers without seeing any big game, it just makes sense to take an interest in the other animals you can see in Kruger. And there are a lot of birds. There are more than 500 species in the park, some found nowhere else in South Africa. We had reached out to a guide that posts regularly on a South African birding Facebook group, Mark Kruger. He guides for a company called Nature Travel Birding. As it turned out, he would be away in Namibia on our date, but his partner Renee was available to guide us for the day. Ren met us at our camp as soon as she could get through the park gates. We told her our birding goals for the day along with a few stretch goals on the mammals, but told her that we would leave the route to her. She has been a birder for 20 years, and right away she was identifying things even on our way out of the camp gates. We had a fantastic day with Rene. We added more than 80 species to our tally for the park, including 5 different species of hornbill. We stuck to the southern routes and did a lot of the gravel roads, which was much more comfortable in her Toyota Fortuner than it was in our rental Sedan. We did a brief stop at the Gardenia Bird Hide, where we also picked up a species of bat for our list. We returned to Afzal for a picnic lunch, and this time I tried a rooster koekiek, which is like a barbecued panini. When we arrived to Afzal, there was a bit of a disturbance among the guests, as a lone hyena was wandering around looking for scraps. When I say disturbance, I don't mean people were running in fear. I mean they were trying to get closer to get photos. We watched one woman with a small child follow the animal into the bush, walking right past the "Do not pass this sign" signs. When an employee tried to call her back, she turned around and waved him off, saying it was okay. My mind was blown. The animals behave this way because people feed them or otherwise don't secure their scraps. This is despite the park conduct rules clearly outlining that this is illegal and can and does result in the animals having to be put down when their behavior becomes problematic. Case in point, a few days after we left, a young male elephant had to be put down as he kept breaking through the fencing at one of the camps. Another sad instance of this was when we were crossing a low road that sat just barely over the water level of a wetland, and this turtle kept swimming up to the vehicle, obviously accustomed to handouts. The turtle will surely end up run over in short order. As it was, I had to open my door to check and give Renee the all clear that it wasn't underneath the vehicle. We had a lot of great mammal sightings throughout the course of the day, too. Many breeding herds of elephants. A herd of water buffalo, which we were excited about as our previous sighting wasn't a great one. A mixed herd of giraffes and zebras and a fair number of white rhinos. We also got some distant looks at 2 different groups of lions, but nothing topped our previous sightings for those. We returned to camp around 3:30 p.m. and Renee led us around the Rhino Trail perimeter, walking trail at our camp, where we picked up a handful more species and watched a hippo floating around in the dam waters behind the restaurant. This is where we were able to pick up our last hornbill species of the day, the trumpeter hornbill, which is apparently quite uncommon in Kruger, as it is more of a coastal species, but they are known residents of the berg-en-dal camp. After we said our goodbyes to Renee, it was still only just coming up on 4:30 p.m. This meant we had another hour and a half before the camp gates closed. So obviously, instead of just taking some downtime, we jumped into the car and headed out again. We drove to a nearby watering hole that's supposed to yield good sunset sightings. And we did find an elephant drinking from the reservoir there, But after seeing probably more than 100 elephants during the day, we were a bit underwhelmed. Sorry, Mr. Elephant. We did, however, come across this field abuzz with white-fronted bee-eaters, of which we got this photo, possibly my favourite of the trip. En route to Cape Town, May 15, 2022. We were packed and out the door of our bungalow before 6 a.m, so we could be in line at the gate right as they opened. We were on a last-ditch mission to find leopards, cheetahs or wild dogs. I thought we were onto something when we came upon a big traffic jam or a dozen or so cars and safari jeeps stopped along a plain. It turned out to be more of a game of telephone situation than a true sighting. Someone told someone else that they heard there may be leopards in this stretch of landscape, and somehow that turned into, "There's a leopard here somewhere." We asked alongside several vehicles, but just got shrugs and shaking heads saying no, they hadn't seen anything either. We did manage a final elephant sighting, a handful of new birds, and an up-close encounter with warthogs right outside the bathrooms at the Mella Lane gate, where we were exiting the park. It was set to be about a 5-hour drive back to the Johannesburg airport. Rain, our bird guide, had told us of a couple of spots to stop for some reliable bird sightings along the way. We opted for a slightly more than midpoint stop at the Alzu Petraport near Middelburg. This is a huge facility with a number of dining options, automated teller machines, a shop, a gas station, and some play equipment for kids. This stop is accessible from either direction on the N4, as they have their own on- and off-ramps. They also house a number of large game species out in their backfields, including white rhinos and a single sable antelope, which are hard to find in Kruger. We made it back to the rental car return with no problems. I have to say, I find the signage in the airport to be lacking and confusing. Both this day and on our return trip home, we really had no indication of where we were nor where we needed to be. We soon settled in at a coffee shop nearby to our gate. We were to be catching a 4 p.m. flight to Cape Town with a duration of 2 hours, arriving sometime around dinner. Unfortunately, after a delay and multiple gate changes, we didn't arrive to our hotel until around 9 p.m, exhausted and famished. Were we to go back to Kruger someday, here are some takeaways I'll keep in mind for next time. Kruger National Park extends 360 km in length and 65 km east to west, covering an area just slightly smaller than the country of Israel. If you incorporate the private game reserves that border the park, known collectively as Greater Kruger, you tack on an additional 3,500 square kilometers. The Greater Kruger area has a continuous perimeter fence along its borders, and the private reserves are fence-free on the side that borders the park, allowing the free movement of wildlife throughout the entire area. The national park has 9 gates, 12 main rest camps, and several satellite camps within. You can also book overnight stays at 2 wildlife hides. The duration of our stay there was predetermined by the original tour booking we had, but it was entirely too short. I would have loved to have stayed a few nights longer and checked out different camps. As you travel through the territory of the park, the habitats and landscapes change, and the makeup of the species you find changes along with it. The private game reserves are host to more luxurious accommodation options, more along the lines of the luxury tented lodges you see on Instagram and in Condé Nast magazines. Of course, these carry with them the luxury price tags you would expect. Had we had more time to research and book things, I would have probably learned sooner that there are multiple fly-in options for getting to Kruger that allow you to skip the 5-hour drive from Johannesburg. One option is the Skukuza Airport, which is located inside the park and has an Avis car rental facility, so you can still self-drive, or there is a complimentary shuttle to Skukuza Rest Camp if you plan to only book safari drives. There are 2 round-trip flights per day to OR Tambo Airport in Johannesburg, operated by Airlink, and they run around $300 per person round trip. The other option is the Kruger Mpumalanga International Airport located near Nelspruit, within an hour's drive to 4 different park gates. A cautionary note regarding the Numbi Gate, the closest access to the Pretorius Cop rest camp. There have been several armed hold-ups on the road out of the park, including one shooting incident that left a young girl wounded. As of the date of this writing, there have been 6 confirmed attacks in the last 8 months. Sandparks has launched a joint task force to address this increase in crime, including security officers at the Numbi Gate and increased police patrols along this stretch of road. Touring Cape Town. May 23, 2022. Our hotel, the Radisson Red, is a super trendy chain of mid-priced boutique hotels designed to appeal to the Instagram generation. The Cape Town location is located in the Silo district of the V&A waterfront, immediately next door to the towering Zeitz Museum of Modern Art. The rooftop features a small lap pool and a food truck, as well as some of the best views you can get from the V&A waterfront. In fact, the first thing we did when we woke up was to hop on the elevator and go check out those views. The second thing we did was set off in search of breakfast. I don't know about other people, but my breakfast usually consists of a bowl of cereal or toast. Some fruit and pastries are also a solid option. I don't know why hotels insist on offering mountains of breakfast foods served buffet style at outrageous prices. In any case, it seemed we were up before most places were open for the day yet, so we fell back on the good old reliable Golden Arches. Yes, that's right, we ate at McDonald's. As much as I love exploring local food options, there's something to be said for being able to walk into a place anywhere in the world and be able to order something you're familiar with. This holds especially true in the mornings when I'm just trying to grab and go to get on with the good stuff. Stomachs full of sausage McMuffins, we strolled over to the V&A office of City Sightseeing, home of red double-decker hop-on hop-off buses you see around the world in tourist cities. We had purchased a 2-day pass, which included 2 days of hop-on hop-off privileges and a boat tour of either the harbour or canals. We also added on the optional Table Mountain aerial cableway ticket to go to the top of Table Mountain. This was to be our first stop of the day as our number one thing to do in Cape Town. Immediately upon redeeming our tickets, the operator informed us that the cableway was closed due to high winds and would not likely be opening on this, our only free day in Cape Town. But given the unpredictable nature of the weather here, the voucher was good for 7 days, so we just had to put that on the back burner for now. Instead, we opted for the free walking tour of the historic city centre area that departed from the Long Street office of City Sightseeing. The Adley Street Flower Market has been in the same location for more than 100 years, and the vendors are mostly descendants of the original Malay vendors. There is an abundance of protea species on offer, including the king protea, the national flower of South Africa. I've been finding the prospect of recapping our walking tour a bit daunting, hence the long delay. Our guide Jonathan was truly top-notch. He is a former teacher and Cape Town born and raised. He has lived through the apartheid era and was in attendance the day Nelson Mandela was set free and gave his speech on the steps of City Hall at the Grand Parade. He was so interesting to listen to and so knowledgeable. There's just no way I can do it justice. I could have followed him around listening to his narrative all day long. One of the biggest takeaways I had from the tour was learning about the different ethnic identities and their various histories and how they are all intertwined. Dating back to pre-colonial times, the Western Cape was populated by indigenous peoples, known now collectively as the Khoisan people, although they are not made up of a single group. They are classified separately from Black Africans along language lines. They don't speak any of the Bantu languages. Their languages are characterized by the prevalence of click consonants. Anthropologically, they are thought to have arrived in South Africa somewhere between 260,000 years and 150,000 years ago. In colonial times, like many indigenous groups around the world, they were marginalized, forcibly relocated, and have faced genocides and European diseases. Then came along Jan van Riebeck in 1652, an agent of the Dutch East India Company who founded the first colonial settlement at Cape Town. The location was chosen for its easy access to a fresh water stream that came down off Table Mountain. The Dutch soon built a stone fort here, the Castle of Good Hope. When it was built, it was along the shoreline of Table Bay, but land reclamation in the decades since mean that now it is quite far inland. In fact, the entire V&A waterfront where we stayed is built on landfill. Cape Town was originally just a waypoint between the Netherlands and the much more important colonial holdings in Southeast Asia. It was a safe place to get fresh produce and water before continuing the journey. The company's expansion meant that soon they didn't have enough labour to provision their ships, and they turned to slavery to make up the shortfall. As company agents were released from their contracts and allocated land in the Cape Colony, the labour shortage became even more acute. They quickly found that the Khoisan people could not be forced into service, and so the Dutch settlers looked to Southeast Asia for slaves. In the 18th century, about 80% of slaves brought to Cape Town were from India. Over the years, depending on colonial rule, slaves were variously brought over from Malaysia, Madagascar, Mozambique and areas of Southeast Africa. The slave trade continued with some minor improvements with regards to the human rights of slaves early in the 19th century. In 1807, when the colony was under British rule, slave trade in the colonies was banned. Slaves were not emancipated, however, until 1834. The population of slaves at this time was around 38,000. During the apartheid era, the peoples of South Africa were classified into 4 groups: blacks, whites, Indians, and coloured people. Coloured people have the genetic makeup of a melting pot of mixed ethnicities including Khoisan, Black African, European, Malay and Indian. They make up 45% of the population of Cape Town today. They were the first speakers of the Afrikaans language. Broadly speaking, they have lighter brown skin tones, high cheekbones and slanted eyes, characteristics of the Khoisan. Picture Nelson Mandela, for instance, whose mitochondrial DNA ties his ancestry with the San people. Jonathan also spoke to us about how, at the age of 17, as a white male he was conscripted into a mandatory 2 years of military service. His time in the military further cemented his views about the apartheid government and how the military was not being used in service of the country, but rather propping up the system of oppression in place at the time. He spoke at length about his admiration for Mandela and Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Fun trivia tidbit: Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu are 2 of 4 Nobel Peace Prize laureates from South Africa, but alternately lived on the same street, Vilakazi Street in Soweto. It is said to be the only street in the world where 2 Nobel laureates have lived. After our walking tour wrapped up, we went back to the Green Market Square, which hosts an artisans market. I think the city centre area took a big hit during the pandemic and tends to have a bit of a reputation for opportunistic crime. The Green Market Square, though full of vendors, was quite empty of shoppers. We ended up buying more here than I expected to, but we found some very unique things. I got a nice little bowl woven out of telephone wire, a warthog and dung beetle welded out of upcycled oil drums, a pair of sunbirds carved out of serpentine stone, and our traditional art souvenir to hang in our hallway gallery. The vendors were all very gracious and grateful for the business. We hopped back on the bus and made a couple of stops around the City Bowl area, including at the Cableways lower station, hopeful that it had maybe reopened. It had not. It was a nice scenic trip with an audio narrative. We drove past the wealthy, wind-free areas of Camps Bay, Clifton and Bantry Bay, as well as past the Sea Point area where we were originally destined to stay, and I'm glad we didn't. Being wind-free is a major real estate selling point in Cape Town, which is one of the windiest cities in the world. This is due to the South Atlantic high-pressure system and the inland low-pressure system meeting over the Western Cape and pushing against one another. The prevailing southeasterly wind is called the Cape Doctor because it is said to blow away all the pollution from the city out to the ocean and clear the air. Back at the V&A waterfront office, we strolled over to the harbour for our included cruise. I wouldn't bother paying extra to do this again, but it was nice to see the Cape fur seals in the harbour.
I guess that one won. This one's kind of a violent jerk.
We walked back to our hotel after this for a bit of a break before heading out in search of dinner. We ate at the nearby Cape Town Fish Market. A seafood dinner for two with drinks, appetizer and tip included cost us around the equivalent of $55 Canadian. Very affordable. We sat out on the patio overlooking the pedestrian swing bridge, which we got to see open a few times to allow sailboats to pass. After dinner, we walked to the other side of the V&A to go grab some groceries for breakfasts and snacks for our next 2 days, which would be spent in the company of our naturalist guide Dominic Chadbon, known as the Fynbos guy. Kirsten Bosch and the Pooh Farm with the Fynbos guy. May 25, 2022. I forget how I originally came across our guide online. Our original travel package had an included tour of the Cape Peninsula and 1 free day, which we were intent to spend birding around Cape Town. One of the TripAdvisor reviews for Dominic said that if he was unavailable for your days in Cape Town, that you should change your days in Cape Town. Thankfully, he was available, both for our original free day, and he also saved us in a pinch when everything got cancelled and took us on his version of a Cape Peninsula tour. Dominic goes professionally by the brand The Fynbos Guy, as the Fynbos is his specialty. Fynbos, pronounced roughly like Fynbos, is the distinct floristic ecosystem native to the extreme southwest of South Africa. It is made up of more than 9,000 species of plants, with a large majority of them being endemic to this tiny region and found nowhere else in the world. More on that in the next blog, though. Today we're focusing on birding. We started our morning by visiting the Kirstenbosch National Botanical Garden. The area that would eventually become Kirstenbosch began as a hedge of wild almond and brambles planted in 1660 by Jan van Riebeck to lend protection to the original Cape Town colony. Portions of the hedge still exist within the garden today. The land was formally set aside as a botanical garden in 1913 with a focus on preserving native flora, the first botanical garden in the world to do so. The garden covers an area of 1,300 acres on the lower eastern slopes of Table Mountain. I knew this going in, but I did not anticipate how much slope there was. I blame my Flatlander upbringing for my struggles with hills. It's definitely something to keep in mind if you have limited mobility. Good thing birdwatching is a slow, rambling activity and not a vigorously paced one instead. The setting really is stunning, especially from the upper reaches of the garden. After our time at the garden, we headed off to the Cape Flats area. Back in colonial times, the Cape Flats were a huge obstacle to eastward expansion out of Cape Town. The area is made up of deep marine sand that has been building up for the last few millennia and was nearly impassable by carts and wagons. These days, the Cape Flats has a reputation for being the most violent area in South Africa. This is thanks to its long history of forced relocations of black and coloured people and the outlawing of those groups from certain areas within Cape Town, leading to informal settlements and extreme poverty. We were heading to the False Bay Nature Reserve area on the edge of the flats. Ronde-Vlei was established as a bird sanctuary in 1952. There's a nice footpath that leads through the Cape Strandeld, the upland sandy vegetation zone. Unfortunately, on this day, the water was mostly dried up and there weren't many birds to be found. There were plenty of Cape dwarf chameleons, however, and finding them was a fun game. They seemed especially fond of hanging out in the restios. I'm not even sure how to describe restios, really. The genus is endemic to South Africa and made up of several dozen species. They date back to the Cretaceous period, when the southern continents were still lumped together as the supercontinent Gondwana. They're distantly related to grasses and sedges, and many have thick, reed-like stems that can grow up to 15 foot in height. They're a very attractive clumping plant and are used ornamentally in suitable climates. The chameleons, with their stripy patterning, blend in very well when they hang out vertically in the restios. Then again, maybe they only have that pattern because they're in the restios. From Ronde-Vlei, we headed to another site within the False Bay Nature Reserve, the Poo Farm. Strandfontein Sewage Works is laid out like a hub and spoke wheel. As with sewage ponds back home, this site is a hotspot for waterbirds, insectivores and birds of prey. Its location directly adjacent to False Bay also makes it a hotspot for seabirds and rarities. It only barely smelled like sewage. After logging somewhere in the vicinity of 70 to 80 bird species, Dominic dropped us back at our hotel for the night. We headed over to the V&A Food Market, which is a food hall located in an old power station within walking distance to our hotel. We were spoiled for choice here with foods from around the world, but we were really anxious to try something traditionally South African. We found a great little stall on the upper level called 7 Colours Eatery. My pictures, taken outside in the dark, do not do this meal justice at all. So I borrowed this picture from their Facebook page as an illustration. We each ordered the 7 Colours plate. Andrew got the chicken and I got the beef potjie, which was a very savoury stew. Each came with all these colourful sides. We strolled back to our hotel and crashed for the night, ready for a 7 a.m. pickup for our Cape Peninsula tour. Cape Peninsula. The Cape Peninsula is the southwesterly-most point of South Africa. A lot of hype is made about how this is where the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean meet. But this is actually not true. That point is about 170 kilometres to the east at the southernmost point, known as Cape Agulhas. Geographically, this makes a lot more sense, as the shape of the continent pushes the Agulhas current down its eastern coast until it meets up with the Benguela current, travelling counterclockwise from South America. We started our day by visiting the Boulders Beach Penguin Colony in Simon's Town. This is one of 2 mainland colonies of the endangered African penguins. They only established on the mainland in the 1980s, and it's thought that this is due to the elimination or vast reduction in the number of predator species on the Cape. The population is declining so quickly, however, that some scientists think that they may become extinct in the wild in the next decade. Currently, their total number stands at 55,000 individuals. We had watched Netflix's Penguin Town docuseries before we left, and we were thrilled when the first place we stopped was actually featured in the show as the nesting spot of Mr. and Mrs. Culvert. Our guide hadn't seen the show and didn't quite understand why we were geeking out over a culvert. Our timing could not have been better, as the penguins were in peak nesting season. Some were still on eggs, but many had hatched chicks with them.
Or 1,000, and you have to knock it with 99. Out there. Look at that.
Oh, wow.
From the penguin colony, we moved on to the Cape Point Nature Reserve towards Olifantsbos Beach on the western side of the Cape. The beach at the trailhead is frequented by a family group of Cape baboons. also known as chacma baboons. Other large game that you can find there includes the bontebok, the eland, the red hartebeest, and the Cape Mountain zebra, a totally distinct zebra species to the ones we saw in Kruger. Groups of bontebok and eland were most frequently seen. This group came down off a ridge and walked right up to the road where we were parked. Dominic said it was one of the best sightings he's had of them. There were probably 30 or more in the group. The Cape Mountain zebra is a subspecies of mountain zebra. The zebras in Kruger were Chapman's zebra, a subspecies of plains zebra. One of the differentiating features is the clean white stripes on the mountain zebras. The plains zebra have what's known as shadow stripes of pale black or brown on the white sections. This species has been reintroduced to the reserve after being locally extirpated, and they're still quite uncommon across their range. The Cape Point Reserve landscape is covered by a shrubby heathland known as the fynbos, or more broadly the Cape Floristic region. There are also several subtypes within the fynbos classification which all break down by the geography of their surroundings and the substrate they sit on. A British botanist named Ronald Good came up with what he determined was the broadest classification system for the world's flowering plants, known as floristic kingdoms. There are 6 kingdoms, the boreal which we share with the vast majority of the landmass north of the equator, the neotropical, Mexico, Central and South America, the paleotropical, the Old World tropics of Africa, the Middle East and Southeast Asia, Australian, Antarctic and South African. The South African floral kingdom is by far the smallest in area, but is home to more than 9,000 species of vascular plants, 69% of which are endemic to the Cape fynbos and found nowhere else on Earth. Pretty mind-boggling stuff. Fun facts. Rooibos tea comes from a fynbos species. The fynbos is like the prairies in that it evolved under the influence of periodic wildfires. Some species only make an appearance after a fire and quickly fall dormant again. The ecosystem is also successional. There are the fast-growing species that colonize quickly post-fire, and then the slower-growing ones that take several years to make their presence known. For botanists and fynbos enthusiasts like our guide Dominic, fire brings renewal. Fynbos fires burn quickly and not too hot, but given the windy situation and widespread urban development around the fynbos, fires are usually suppressed by emergency services. Controlled burns have razor-thin windows and have to meet stringent weather conditions. Sandparks will be attempting to conduct prescribed burns in the area of the Cape Point main entrance gate for the first time in 100 years. We walked the shipwreck trail from Oliphant's Boss Beach, learning about the dynamic environment of the shoreline here. We passed by 2 shipwrecks, the Thomas T. Tucker, an American Liberty-class weapons carrier built during World War II. The ship's compass was unknowingly out by 37 degrees and ran aground on its maiden voyage trying to reach Suez with a hold full of tanks. Most of its cargo was salvaged. The second wreck was that of the M.V. Noluth, a Dutch merchant ship loaded with whiskey. The ship struck the same rock in 1965 that the Thomas T. Tucker hit in 1942, Albatross Rock. The captain steered the ship aground as it began taking on water in an attempt to save its cargo. This marked the first time that helicopters were used in a maritime rescue to evacuate the crew. It felt pretty surreal to be walking these wild beaches at the end of the world. We had the area mostly to ourselves, save a small handful of other hikers. But I've never been much for long walks on beaches, and my knees and hips were starting to protest the ever-shifting ground under my steps. The 40 kilometers an hour headwind didn't do me any favors either. Thankfully, we moved upland a bit to the more solid fynbos for the return trip back to the car. From here, we had a pit stop for a picnic lunch, which Dominic provided both days we were booked with him. Some sliced veggies, lunch meat and cheese, boiled eggs, hummus and ciabatta made for a nice refresher midday. After lunch, we carried on to the Cape of Good Hope and Cape Point, for the obligatory photo op. With a brief ramble along Buffals Bay Beach, we wrapped the day. We took the scenic route back to Cape Town, meandering along the western coast. We rounded Chapman's Peak and stopped for a scenic overlook of Hout Bay. By the time we parted ways with Dominic, I didn't have it in me to walk the kilometre across the harbour back to the food hall, which had been my intention. Instead, we went back to the nearby Cape Town fish market we had tried our first night out. And that's a wrap. I hope you got something useful out of this essay. Or at the very least you enjoyed the pictures. Oh yeah. The weather cooperated, and we made it to Table Mountain on our last day before heading to the airport. Until next time.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Table Mountain Aerial Cableway. Just a friendly reminder, please do not remove your mask inside the cable car. Please keep it on for the full duration on the trip. And for your safety, do not step away from the sides, do not lean or hold onto any handrails. The floor rotates.
It's clear in the video.
Ascorbic acid, amoxicillin,